So today's topic is designing for disasters, hazard mitigation, and green buildings. According to the Texas Forest Service, the 2011 fire season, which started on November 15th of 2010 and went through October 31st of 2011, there were 27,976 fires that burned 3,959,040 acres. 2,862 homes, over 2/3 of those which were just the Labor Day weekend, and over 2,700 other structures. 47% of all acreage burned in Texas in 2011, 47% of all acreage burned in the United States in 2011 was in Texas. So we have a major issue that we need to deal with. There are a lot of factors that contribute to that, and we want to put it all together to create a sustainable environment where we can coexist with what happens in Texas. There were 4 huge fires last year that affected all of us: Bastrop, Pedernales, Steiner Ranch, and Oak Hill. And I'm sure that everybody here was impacted in some way by those fires. The first 2 speakers that we have today are Meredith Gray and Philip Gordon from the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management with the City of Austin. Meredith Gray is a lead professional with dual master's degrees in community and regional planning from LBJ Public Affairs. Regional planning from the School of Architecture, and in public affairs from the LBJ School at UT Austin. Philip has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Cal State and a master's in community and regional planning from the UT Austin. And they will be providing the initial overview of climate change, the impact, and what we're facing.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Meredith Gray, and this is my colleague, Phil Gordon. We're both from the City of Austin Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Thanks, guys. So today we'd like to redefine for designers, for engineers, and for builders what makes a sustainable building. A building that's sustainable is generally considered to be a building that's environmentally friendly and energy efficient. But we'd like to tell you today that a building that's sustainable is also a hazard resilient building. If you look at this building on the left here, it might be made of recycled materials, it might use native plants, and it might be incredibly energy efficient. But if something happens like a flood or a wildfire, this building is not necessarily as sustainable as you might think it would. This chart shows the FEMA disaster declarations for the last 50 years. As you can see, in the last 50 years, FEMA disaster declarations have been increasing at a rapid rate. So a hazard is not just made on its own. A disaster is not made on its own. A hazard plus a lack of preparation equals a disaster. Hazard mitigation for buildings is sustainability. Buildings that are durable are sustainable. They shouldn't blow up or burn down or get flooded or sink into the ground or get washed away or have issues with subsidence. They should protect human life and property. If you're building a green building and you haven't considered what materials are going into that building, if those materials are flammable and if they're durable, then you haven't fully considered if your building is sustainable or not.
Why talk about disasters in green building? Well, mostly for the points she's already brought up, but so with climate change kind of at the forefront of everybody's minds, it's been predicted that disasters are going to get more and more frequent. There'll be larger swings in weather, and these things are going to happen more often, especially with the majority of people living closer to the coast and in other high hazard areas like the wildland urban interface. With the wildland urban interface sprawl, you're going to have more and more problems like we saw in Bastrop and we had in Austin and Travis County last Labor Day. And of course, if we then try to fight the wildland interface problem by cutting down all the trees, that's going to lead to more problems flooding downstream. So it's really kind of an issue, it's a very complex issue that can't be solved with any kind of one method. Next. So, it's not just the buildings themselves. That's kind of a point we want to drive home. It's about the neighborhoods, and it's about the people who live in the neighborhoods. So it's about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. It's not just a collection of resilient buildings, so it's not just making bunkers of buildings. It's also creating communities who know to look out for each other, who know the area, who know what their hazards are, who know when to get on their neighbor who's not picking up the shrubbery and bushes and burned out stuff that's closer to their houses. It's about ingress and egress. It's about getting out of the neighborhood. It's about designing neighborhoods that have more than one way out, that aren't on 15, 20-degree slopes so that a fire truck can get up there if need be. So it's about site selection. It's about community. Next. So this is just a thing I adapted from a paper I wrote long ago. But so looking at LEED for neighborhood development or LEED for new construction, there's very little on the topic of hazard resilience. There's a little bit about slope exposure and a very little bit about flooding, 100-year floodplain, that kind of basic stuff. Looking at the way engineers tackle these types of hazards through building hardening and things like that, they're slightly better than what LEED does if you let them build the way they could. But then it's about combining those two into creating something that's more. So if you take a planner's approach by having site selection, ingress and egress, community planning, bringing people together to look at the hazards of their area, you get kind of a better approach. So again, we're not sitting here proposing that you can make a building or a neighborhood completely safe from all disasters. And because of that, you need to have neighborhoods that are built for evacuation. So people can get in and out. One of the big problems in Bastrop is there's only one way out, one road out of these neighborhoods, and so you're having to drive through fire to get out. So there should be multiple points of entry and exit. Prevention of property loss is also paramount. As we said, if you have you can have this greenest building in the world made of recycled materials, but if the building burns down and you have to rebuild it, then what did you really gain there? And then insurance companies should have a particular interest in this. So you can leverage insurance companies an actuarial kind of thinking in terms of designing buildings and communities that are more resilient towards disaster.
Unfortunately, building codes, especially in Texas, aren't always as effective as they could be. The International Organization for Standardizations, or ISO, has a building code effectiveness grading schedule. So if you look at this chart down here, this shows just for Texas communities, all the different communities that have building codes and what this ISO has given them a grade of for those communities. So looking at communities in Texas, we've got a lot of codes that are 5s and 6s, where a grade of 1 is an exemplary commitment to building code enforcement, and a grade of 10 means that it's really an unsafe building code. We're looking at both personal lines, which is the lighter color, and commercial lines. So personal is 1 and 2 family dwellings, codes for 1 and 2 family dwellings, and then the darker kind of oranger color is more for commercial, which is all other buildings. So building code effectiveness in Texas communities is lacking right now. For those who want to go above and beyond what is actually mandated, it does require additional commitment to sustainable building. Another issue is if something gets a LEED designation, does that necessarily mean that that building is safe? Does that mean that that building is fully resilient and durable in case of hazards? Some LEED Platinum certified buildings constructed in hazard-prone areas aren't necessarily constructed as well as they could be or beyond code for hazard mitigation methods. An example would be the California Academy of Sciences building. That building, the original museum, was destroyed twice by earthquake, once in 1906 and once in 1989. And so the new Academy of Sciences building was designed to be as sustainable as possible. Unfortunately, when considering sustainability, although they met earthquake and seismic standards, they didn't necessarily exceed them. And they didn't exceed those standards for any other hazards as well. And I feel like in order for a building to get LEED Platinum designation, it really does need to be going above and beyond in all possible areas of the code, not just in what's required in California state law.
So this is just a kind of a general overview of wildfire risk. Each dot shows the location of wildfires that are greater than 250 acres from 1980 to 2003. It's the newest map we could find. Of course, there would be some more dots in the central Texas area there if we had a more modern map. So this is the fire danger forecast map a year ago today. All the very high, high, extreme in the panhandle areas of fire risk. And so that was just last year now. Now look, now we see that and like, oh great, it's been wetter. Not as much danger. We're kind of in a low, moderate kind of bridge area there in the middle. But the kind of the point of this is that these things change rapidly. So just because you look at something at the moment and there's a high fire risk or a low fire risk doesn't mean that's going to be the way in the future. So it's about kind of looking to the future and planning for the future. If we had like a month of kind of hot, dry weather, which we're going to have because it's summer, this map is going to change drastically in the next month. So again, going back to Bastrop, an extreme event to be sure, lots of homes lost, lots of homes that didn't have to be lost necessarily. Next slide. So kind of some of the things that you're going to hear about in terms of code later on in some of the presentations. This. Okay, so you have kind of a standard ranch-style home with a patio at back, made of wood, with dead foliage underneath the patio. Now, what do you think is going to happen to that building once that fire goes underneath that patio? House is gone. Just gone. So things as simple as construction materials, building communities that want to clear out the underneath of their patios and make sure that's a priority for their community in either HOA regulations or however, are just some of the things that can really just save a house. I took a tour of the Steiner Ranch area, and you'd see a house that had one of these decks. That the deck got burned and the house got torched and half the house was gone. And then you'd have one that was just a simple concrete slab patio. The fire burned up to that concrete slab, stop. Because concrete doesn't really burn in a fire. So just things like that to kind of think about, the fire resilience. Next.
So what current mitigation efforts are underway right now? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the FireWise program, and one of the AFD presentations will address that more later. That's trying to get community members themselves and homeowners themselves more engaged in wildfire mitigation for their own properties. The City of Austin has a hazard mitigation plan that's now addressing wildfire more seriously. We have a community wildfire protection plan for the community that's underway, especially in the areas near Steiner Ranch that are very prone to wildfire, that are in the wildland urban interface. The Texas Forest Service now just has produced a website that you all might want to go check out. It's texaswildfirerisk.com. If you type in an address, you can actually see your risk. You can see the building site that you're looking at, and you can see what the building risk is, what the wildfire risk is for that specific site. So please write down that address and go check it out. And there's additional, this is the time right now to talk about wildfire mitigation. There's a lot of recent public awareness because of the wildfires we've had in the past. But the question is this enough? Will this, recent awareness, this will eventually begin to fade? And if we don't have builders who are actively invested in making more sustainable, more durable buildings, this awareness might not be enough. So right now, what does Austin Energy Green Building have? Austin Energy's basic commercial requirements are listed here. Right now, Austin Energy Green Building Standards do not include hazard mitigation. They do look at site selection. They look at floodplains as an issue that they want to avoid that when they're selecting a site. But they don't necessarily look at all hazards. We're advocating an all hazards approach to sustainable building. So what next steps would there be? We would like to leverage the existing green building practices. There's a lot of guidelines and codes out there that are very respectable, that are have been tested through time and definitely work. But Austin Energy Green Building, as well as LEED, don't currently include that all hazards mitigation approach. These standards do improve implementation and compliance, and we'd like to incorporate all hazards into, ideally, any green building program that considers itself a sustainable building program would include an all hazards approach to mitigation. And that should also complement general sustainability goals. So for that new Austin Energy Green Building Credit Area, what would that look like? It could be maybe called hazard mitigation and resilience. And potential points could be awarded for wildfire mitigation, for having site selection plan, for having neighborhood mitigation planning, so the whole neighborhood has evacuation plans in place ahead of time. That rubric could also include floodplain mitigation, tornado mitigation, really just an all hazards approach.
So really what we're talking about here is that Austin Energy, or just the city in general, has an opportunity to be the national leader in green building, including hazard mitigation. Both Austin Energy Green Building and LEED are ideal frameworks to include something like this as a voluntary program. And it's about leveraging public-private partnerships, and also about getting the neighborhood involved, getting the current residents, the future residents involved, so that they know their hazards, they know what they're up against, and they know what they have to do to prepare for it and to deal with a disaster should it happen. Thank you.
We'll take questions after the other presentation.
Yeah, there'll be a whole QA thing.
So our next speaker is going to be Josh Porche with the City of Austin Fire Department.
He's been with the city for 16 years and a wildland firefighter for 14. He's also the FireWise program coordinator. So welcome, Josh.
There has been a huge effort in the city and in the county to try to coordinate different divisions and different departments for really just coordinating efforts to try to reduce the losses. We've got a lot of folks all over the city, all over the county, all over the state that's kind of focused on this, and so trying to get everybody harnessed together and working together has been really vital. As it pertains to you all and what Carl Wren, our lead engineer, is going to talk about today is the WUI Code, or the Wildland Urban Interface Code, and how that affects sustainability. But something that they mentioned in their presentation that kind of really tied that in for me was that, yeah, we have minimum standards, but if it just meets the standard, what is that really going to achieve? I mean, yeah, it's going to kind of do the job maybe, but 80% of the time or 60% of the time, I don't know what the stats that kind of is supposed to lead to that. But asking builders and other divisions to kind of step up and do the right thing, and also accepting the WUI code and as we're trying to present and as we're trying to move forward with it, and understanding that, yeah, it may seem a little harsh, or it may seem a little crazy, but we've got to set the bar up high so we can reduce the losses from these wildfire events. Were we able to get that thing? Not really? All right. Reiterating a little bit of what we already talked about, but the biggest thing is trying to recognize the losses that we had and what we could potentially save and reduce the losses of. A little bit of last year's fire season, as she discussed before. I won't go into too much of the numbers again, but you can see they're huge. They're astronomical. And again, that was 47.3% of the acres that was lost in the entire U.S. That's pretty huge. So a little bit closer to home, the Pinnacle Fire down near Oak Hill. Something that we'll also try to hammer home today is that these fires in and around Austin and Travis County, they don't have to be that big of fires. In the whole grand scheme of things, the Pinnacle Fire, somewhere around 100 acres, but we still lost 11 homes roughly and destroyed 10 others. 100 acres really isn't that big. Some of the other bigger fires that we have across the U.S. right now, I know that there's a fire in, the Ruidoso fire, I think, is somewhere over 34,000 acres. Another fire in Colorado, somewhere around 54 acres. And these are fires that are going on right now. I went to Fort Davis last year as well. That was, what was that, 300,000 acres, or what, no, yeah, like 300 something thousand acres. So in the whole grand scheme of things, 100 acres really isn't that big of a deal. Go ahead. A couple pictures from that. The biggest thing I want you to take away from these pictures is, if we're looking at these, we still have a lot of vegetation that's present. We still have some fairly hardened homes. That's our term of being fire resistant or whatnot. Brick, hardy. I've even got some pictures in here of homes with metal roofs. So yeah, a lot of that stuff is going to help and it's going to make a big difference. But there's other keys, other little things that all kind of tie things together. Go ahead. The Steiner Ranch fire, again, 125 acres. 24 homes destroyed, 30 lost. We had, at that point during that event, we had firefighters from all over the state. I was talking on the radio to folks that I had been to other fires that season or done other training from as far as Dallas, Fort Worth area. Pretty wild event. And what you guys need to take away from that is that all of this stuff and the FireWise program and all of these efforts and sustainability, yeah, it's a big deal, and we want to reduce our losses and reduce our, hey, how do you like that? But at the end of the day, we just really don't have the resources to respond to these fires. Like I said, we had people from all over the state. And so if we can't adequately respond to these incidents when they blow up and get as large as they are, and it's not just us, it's any department in the country, the losses are just gonna go up. They're gonna increase. They're gonna, we're gonna lose more structures that may have been hardened, that may have gone through all the planning that we're discussing. But what we have is essentially a change in fuels. We have these wildfire events, and they change to home to home to home. So again, paying attention to these principles that we're talking about, particularly the FireWise program that we'll talk about as well. Go ahead. So again, 125 acres, and we had huge losses from the event. These are pictures within Steiner. Again, you can still see a lot of vegetation that's present. You can still see, you don't see a huge wall of fire that's coming in and burning down these neighborhoods. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. These are brick homes. These are all newer homes, hardy board. And I'm not trying to discount everything that we've already talked about, but all of these things all add up together. Is kind of my point. We'll go ahead. And then again, the Bastrop fire. Go ahead and click through that. It's pretty amazing videos. This is what we see during these wildfire events. Yeah, we may have a huge flame front, huge blow up of fires, but what's going to happen? Go ahead and go forward. So one of the big things that we learned is we can reduce the losses, and the reason we reduce those losses is because of the embers. And so yeah, we have these huge blow-ups and these huge landscape fires or canopy fires that literally burn everything from the leaves on the ground to the tops of the trees. And we'll have those in certain places, but it's not, typically it doesn't stay there the entire time. It'll kind of drop down out of the canopy, it drops up in the, climbs up. We'll have what called torches, torching out or blow up in these events. But honestly, any type of event like that across the country, if we're not managing our lands properly and we're not putting in some of the other concepts that we'll talk about, there's not a whole lot that any fire department in the world is going to do to stop these events. So it brings us back to some of the weather events that we're seeing and some of the larger changes in landscape that we're seeing. But the biggest thing that we can do and that we have control over is what we talked about, the construction of the building, the placement of the building, and the landscape around it. So we saw that the majority of the homes, again, I alluded to it, they all burned down from the ember storms. We may have had this huge wildfire event, but what it does is they throw up these huge ember storms, and those embers all have to come down somewhere. And so having structures that are as non-combustible as possible, having all of the enclosures, of the vent spaces, any of that stuff well sealed up. And so having our buildings and structures with the minimum amount of available fuel beds, as I always say, is going to reduce the losses. So not having gutters that are overflowing with debris, not having the wooden decks. There's lots of other alternatives to building wooden decks. They are a little more costly, but again, if we reduce the loss from the wildfire event, or we reduce the losses we don't have to rebuild, then we save money in the long run, and I think that's kind of the whole point here. So this is a great picture. The video on YouTube, we could send out the link to it if you guys are interested. But what they did was a study, and these are huge ember producers on homes that were very well hardened. They had great landscape. They had decent landscape. They had great construction. But it was, hey, let's just bombard these homes as they would during a wildfire event and see what catches on fire. As you can see on this side, I think was all vinyl siding. And later on in the pictures, and we don't go through the video, but you can probably guess that stuff kind of lights up. And what tends to happen is anywhere that we have a flat space or a right angle, we'll have these embers that kind of pile up and build up. And I always talk about this, but in the firehouse, one of the big jokes always is after folks come back from a big fire, it's like, man, how'd that big fire, that big 4-alarm fire or whatever, how'd it start? Well, it all started by a little bitty flame about this big. And that's really equates back to wildfire events. So not having any place that any of these little small fires can start is critical. And so being creative with our construction, being creative with our landscape, and so we have separations across the landscape or out in the yard that aren't going to let fire kind of extend over to the structure. Okay. Another picture of those ember storms that are typically our enemy. And you can see in most of these fires, you don't see, and a lot of these are, this isn't a test fire, but a lot of these fires, you don't see these huge walls of fire coming in behind. And that's another big thing that I want you folks to take away from this is it isn't these, I know people get tired of hearing me say it, but it isn't these huge tsunamis of fire that come in and just engulf communities or structures or homes or anything like that. Yeah, you're going to have a huge fire, but well ahead of all of these events, you have the ember storm. And so you have all these other spot fires and the other fires that get started. And if the resources aren't available, or if the structures aren't hardened and they have plenty of available fuel beds or places where these other smaller fires can start, then those small fires are going to grow to be big fires. That one structure that may not have done everything that they should have done as far as construction or how, cleaning out the gutters, getting rid of all the junk underneath the wooden patio decks. We can go down that whole list. But if that structure, that home or that property didn't do all those things, then all they're going to do is just burn down their neighbors after that house catches on fire. And we saw that a lot last year. Go ahead. Again, any little place that has a corner that can block the wind, that debris can settle. And what I tell folks is walk around your home or walk around your neighborhood after like a windstorm, and you're going to see all of these little piles of debris up against the wooden patio or up against the wooden privacy fences. You're going to see it up in places like this. You're going to see the gutters filled up. Any corner of the fence in the yard. Any of those places that we see leaf litter and debris build up, that's where these small fires are going to start. It's just, and a lot of it is because just the way the air is going to move through there and the wind is going to blow through those areas. If it's going to drop debris, then it's going to drop embers. And those embers are going to land and they're going to start the small fires and they're going to build up. This is from that other ember study. This is a camera inside of one of the attic vents. One of the recommendations that we see, and we saw a lot of the homes last year burning down, and a lot of the pictures that we already saw, most of these fires start from attic fires. And our attic is typically the one space that we have a lot of ventilation. We're in Central Texas. We want to ventilate the crap out of our homes. We want to get as much of that hot air out, get air movement through there and get things going. Well, if air can come out, then air is going to go in. So we have to be really careful with how we protect those vents and those spaces from the embers from coming in. So one of our recommendations is, most of those vents come with some type of mesh, but they oftentimes have like a 1/4 inch openings, and typically that mesh is really there just to keep out rodents or birds, bugs, yada yada yada. Well, now we're seeing that wildfires and these wildfire events are that much more critical, and we got to protect ourselves from them. So we recommend screening as tight as a window screen mesh. It has to be metal. Oftentimes that stuff has an opening that's as small as a 1/16 of an inch or so. And so we kind of have to weigh our ventilation and getting some of that air out versus letting embers in. And so we may have to identify where our structure is located, what side of the structure is. If we have a green space near there, is that a side that we want to pay extra close attention to those types of items? On the other side, we may not be quite as critical to some of those attic venting. Does that kind of make sense? Go ahead. Here's a picture of one of those homes. Stone building, metal roof, and look again, you got plenty of vegetation out there. And so they may have had decent defendable space around it, but if we didn't pay attention to the stuff around the home, patio furniture, firewood up against the house, the wooden decks that weren't protected, and then the stuff that's on those wooden decks, really the biggest reason we saw a lot of these homes burn down were from those attic vents, and not paying attention to those things, and or the gutters. We had a lot of homes that had vinyl gutters, and it's up above our head. We don't tend to look in them as much as we should. We don't clean them out. Well, again, any of those small fires, they're going to extend. And so during these wildfire events, as firefighters, what we find ourselves doing is literally just running laps around structures, running laps from home to home to home, from privacy fence to vinyl gutter to patio furniture to the piles of fireplaces. And that's not to say that's the only reason. I mean, there was definitely a lot of homes that burned down just because they had vinyl siding up against the walls, the wildlands or those other spaces. There were a lot of homes that didn't have the proper construction, for the space that they were in. Something that we have to take away from this as homeowners and property owners is we like our landscape, we love our landscape, we love the green belts and we love the vegetation. But to be able to live next to those, in those positions, we have to take responsibility for that too. And so even in Texas, they tell us that over 90% of the fires typically are started by some type of human factor. And so by living there, it's taking that responsibility that we're protecting the wildland, but we're also having to kind of step up the bar a little bit for some of the events that occur in those wildlands. Because the truth of the matter is fire belongs in all of these landscapes. You know, it's part of our ecosystem. It's what keeps those landscapes from being overgrown. It gets rid of the dead vegetation that gets left over the years. It's what gets rid of certain species and keeps them in check, as opposed to letting other species proliferate or whatever. So what we teach and what we talk about a lot with homeowners is that we have to become fire adaptive. And so we have to live and we have to prepare our structures and our homes and our properties as if there's going to be a wildfire event out in that landscape any given day of the week. And it's kind of hard to keep that in mind this year when we looked at the wildfire risk. And yeah, this week they have reduced our drought index and our wildfire threat level. But what's it going to be next week if we don't get any rain? Because those charts, if I'm not, I'm pretty sure that those are updated about every week. And so that stuff fluctuates, and it fluctuates on rainfall. It fluctuates relative humidity, winds, yada, yada, yada. So this is an overhead picture of Steiner Ranch. And if you can see, this is going to be 620 up here, kind of where the fire blew up. And again, fire scar, fire scar, fire scar, one over in here. It didn't completely burned out all black. And so again, that tells us that most of these fires, at least in our part of the world and in most parts of the country, they blow up with these torching and throw out these ember storms, and they start all these other smaller fires out ahead. Well, if we don't have the right construction, if we're not taking care of the landscape around our home, all of those small fires from those ember storms, they're going to build up and they're going to extend our structures, and we're going to lose structures. Again, another picture, you know, talking to folks that have way more wildland experience than I do. Back in the day, they used to refer to the vegetation that gets left behind during these wildfire events as magic trees. It's like, wow, look at that magic tree. Why didn't it burn? You know, well, it must be the species, or it must be this, or it must be that. No, it's because if we haven't paid attention to our construction or to our landscape around the homes, then we are going to have available fuel beds around the home, and again, those little small fires are going to extend, and they're going to burn down our homes. And our home is either going to burn down our neighbors, or our neighbors are going to burn down ours. So again, there are no magic trees out there. There are no magic fences or no magic anything. It's being responsible and building an appropriate structure that can sustain these events. Today we're talking about wildfire events. Go ahead. So again, kind of recapping a lot of the stuff that we talked about, we saw a lot of homes get burned down. Get burned down, does that sound right? But that were lost, typically due to the gutters being not cleaned out, whether they're vinyl, those were really susceptible, or just weren't cleaned out very well. The attic vents, I talked about that a whole lot. The attic vents were ridiculous. A lot of firefighters have stories. I mean, during these events, you're literally running for hours and hours because these ember events occur. They sit and they smolder, and then they blow up here. They may blow up here. We don't have just this huge wildfire that we go and we fight and we do it and like, sweet, we're done. Let's go home. No, it goes through the night. Folks are standing by. We hang out through the evening. I mean, I didn't leave. I don't know what time the Steiner Ranch fire started, but it was somewhere around 2 o'clock or so. I didn't leave there till 3 o'clock, and the only reason I left is because we were able to clear up other crews to come in and rotate out. And at one point, I mean, we were literally just laying in the street because we were just beat tired, and that was after finding out on the radio, well, we got a house that we're seeing smoke coming up, you know, 2 blocks away. We've got this house over here. And so throughout the evening and throughout the night, these smoldering fires, they finally break out. They finally build up enough heat. Same story with the Pinnacle fire. I think it was, I heard stories from those folks as well. You know, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, they're getting a report of another fire 2 blocks away. And a lot of these were from the top few, you know, those gutters that started fires. They get up under the eave, under the soffit, or underneath the shingles. The attic vents, the patio furniture. They did, and I wish I knew all the details, but in Bastrop, they did this trampoline study that they called it, and they went out to all these homes and took the trampolines and took the square inches and figured out how many little ember burns there were. and it was astronomical. I mean, you could find anything like that, whether it was patio furniture, trampolines, anything that was combustible, and you are going to see the beginning effects of fires, these little embers that go and they land. And luckily for the trampoline and for some of the patio furniture, it just wasn't able to sustain the combustion and kind of extend. What's that?
When I read down this list, I can think of mitigation techniques to use for all of them except for the wooden privacy fences. Would you recommend instead?
For the wooden privacy fences, there are alternatives to wooden privacy fences. A lot of times when I go into neighborhoods and a lot of them have deed restrictions that require wooden privacy fences. And so what I recommend for folks like that is putting some type of non-combustible barriers throughout it. If it's a brick home, why not put a brick column every 40 or 50 feet or so in that fence, or maybe at the corners, but definitely that area next to the home, because as soon as I respond to a wildfire event or a wildland urban interface event involving structures, the first thing I'm going to do is if there are privacy fences or wooden privacy fences, I'm just going to literally rip the gates down on the side. The next thing I'm going to do is go in the backyard and I'm literally just going to kick out a panel, because I know that fence, if it's not on fire, it's going to catch on fire. It's just what happens. But if I can kind of cut the wick, if you will, put some type of column, or remove the fuel in there, then I can do that. And I don't care if the wooden privacy fence catches on fire. It can. So the next thing I pay attention to is where is it going to go and what's it going to extend to. And so I can have stuff when we respond and we do triage, or we figure out which homes we're going to be able to save, because the truth of the matter is majority of the time, we are not going to save every single structure. We are not going to have the resources there available. Again, the Steiner Ranch fire, there was 3 homes that I said, well, told my firefighters, don't go in that backyard. If they ignite, then we're just going to cut it off at the street, kind of thing. That decision was made long before I got there. There was the canopy, the vegetation, the growth, it was growing all the way to the house. It didn't stop. There was no defensible space, which is another term that I didn't really sprinkle in here too much, but because we were kind of focused more on construction. But did that answer your question? If it's a stone house, a stone pillar, I see a lot of folks putting in like a wrought iron section. Anything that literally just kind of separates the fuel. And so I'm not saying that you can't have anything that's combustible around the property, around the home, because that's unrealistic. But what we have to start thinking about is, if that catches on fire, where is it going to go? And go ahead, I think I've got some pictures in here. I don't know where we are on time. I'm probably going to start going through some of this stuff a little faster. Go ahead, one more. It's a little later on, but we've got some pictures of a rock wall. And the idea is, the grass can burn outside of the home or out in the yard, but if we've got these little dividers, these other like landscaping features that we can kind of sprinkle in the property that look great oftentimes when they're non-combustible, then those also add to create separations around the property. Talking about the Firewise program specifically, the Firewise program kind of divides up the structure in the home and the property in zones. And so the most critical point is really the structure itself. And so then as we move out, we're less critical with some of the non-combustible features and how there's separations in the fuels and whatnot. Go ahead. Again, just another, and even in this picture here, you can see some of the things I'm talking about, and even some of the stuff we talked about before. Yeah, this may be some wooden porch feature, and it is a cartoon picture, I understand, but what it's trying to depict is those wooden members are much larger. They're not small wooden members, and so they're a lot harder to ignite. They're also supported by a concrete pad, and so we don't have the vegetation that can burn all the way up to the base of these guys and light them off. Again, non-combustible features around the property that act as separators or fire breaks. Go ahead. And this goes into a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. But it is. I mean, it really is the little things. It's the vent space underneath the soffits. Is there any place that embers can get in there and get blown in there? It's the gutters, making sure that they're clean. Some folks and some WUI codes across the country require a covering for the gutters. I mean, they're talking about spackling around the windows. I mean, any little crevice, any little place around the trim that could allow embers or debris to get in there and ignite. And it seems meticulous, but those are the little things that all add up. Go ahead. We can go, we're kind of beating this into the ground. Go ahead. Here's that one of the pictures that we've got. And so we can kind of integrate some of these non-combustible landscape features around the property. I've seen others, I don't think I have pictures of it, but using like some of the decomposed granite, you know, as just little decorative walking paths to the yard. Because we think we maintain our yard, and we think that we mow it, and we think that we even water it at times. But during these events, those fuels, that grass and stuff, and it kind of referencing back to the wildfire risk map, those things change in hours. I mean, the grass in our lawn, the fuel moisture in that stuff will dry out within hours. Same thing with some of any of the smaller fuels, the smaller grasses, twigs, you know, brush like that. It dries out really quick. It's the trees and stuff that takes a long time to rehydrate and to dry out. Go ahead. This is similar to what we would do during a wildfire event, talking about just kicking out that panel. That's something that we're going to do.
Why are you kicking out the panel?
I want to cut that wick off, and I wouldn't leave it like that year round, but when I get there, that's what I'm going to do, because this privacy fence, I'm pretty sure this was from the Pinnacle, and this fire was moving in from the back. And so again, those guys and girls on the fire trucks didn't care if this wooden privacy fence burned down. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to cut it off here and stop it, because that wooden privacy fence is going to burn.
You want to stop the burn from the left to the right side?
Yes, sir.
It's
Yeah.
not for a wind or an ember?
No, nothing like that. And so what we talked about beforehand, as a property owner or homeowner, instead of me having to kick that panel out, what you could have done was put some type of column there, so it would be a little more decorative feature that is non-combustible, that breaks that wick. Does that make sense?
Breaks the run of-
Yes, sir. Go ahead. Because this is what's going to happen. You know, any little right angle or any flat space, if it's perpendicular to the wildland or wherever that wind's coming in, it's going to catch embers. You know, that's just a fact. That's what's going to happen. This is kind of not the best picture, but that's the idea on a very small scale of what we're going to see. You see the garden hose there. Having those available around the home is really, really helpful, because I'm going to use them. You know, any resources I can use. I'm going to use your garden hose. I'm going to use your ladders. I'm going to use any of that stuff, because I want to try to use your stuff more than I can use mine. And again, back to the Firewise program, we talk about that, you know, and paying attention to weather events. So, man, it's been super dry. Temperature's going to be really high tomorrow. Humidity's going to be low, and this is hypothetically speaking. On those days, as property owners, as homeowners, we say, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to make sure, or today, preparing for the upcoming weather event, I'm going to make sure that my gutter's cleaned out. I'm going to make sure that I've got a garden hose out there and ready, yada, 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 you know. Go ahead. Go ahead, one more. And again, like we talked about, this is a huge community event. And I don't want this picture to look like the first step in a community event is we go out there and cut brush. That is absolutely not the case. My point is, with this picture, is we had the entire community out there all focused on it. This particular community has also, for years, been engaged in homeowner education, home structure preparation and improvements. We've gone out and had contractors go through all of their wooden, or most of their attic vents. I've gone out and do home assessments just on the properties. And this was long before we even talked about removing vegetation and fuel. Because again, getting back to that other slide for the Firewise program, the most important thing is the structure. We start there and we start moving away. Because as our efforts move away from those structures, it gets much more expensive and it oftentimes gets less efficient. Go ahead. As you can see here, this is after some of our fuel mitigation plans. A lot of biomass there, but as you can see, we didn't remove the canopy at all. We just got rid of some of the stuff on the bottom and the dead and down stuff. And the idea behind that is we kind of slow down the intensity, reduce the ember production. Go ahead. This is just kind of a recap of what's going on in the city. We talked a little bit about the Wildfire Task Force. That got started between a lot of the departments that are probably represented here in the front and in the room. But we started kind of having meetings, and it was like, man, this is way bigger than this, and collectively we can get a lot more done. So we started meeting with representatives from all over the city. That got expanded to the county representatives, anywhere from folks from PARD, folks from AWU, folks from Watershed. Now we've got, obviously the Texas Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, DPS. From there, we identified, what are some of the things we need to do? Well, we can't let communities and neighborhoods keep building like this. We can't let structures keep being built the way they're being built, because given the opportunity, we're probably going to go the least expensive route, and oftentimes either least expensive or what we feel as being feasible isn't always going to be the most protected, structure. And if we're losing structures to these events, well, one, that's using resources, that's going to cost money, and two, back to sustainability, we're not reducing our footprint at all. And so what we brought in for that was some of the WUI code efforts, and which is the Wildland Urban Interface codes that addresses placement of the structure, neighborhood development, construction features, things like that. And then also within the city, we're also working with the public information officers on a wildfire campaign, educating the homeowners on lifestyles, building practices, good housekeeping around the yard. Some of these pictures are pretty amazing. This is another one that always kind of gets me. This is the Fort Davis fire. Pretty wild event. I believe that's it. So, and again, I think we're going to address questions at the end. But thank you all very much.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Carl Wren. I work for the Austin Fire Department's Fire Prevention Program. Been with the fire department almost 25 years, 24 and a half years. 30 plus years in the fire service. I was a certified firefighter before I came here, but I've been in fire protection engineering for 33 or 34 years as well. I'm the code geek, okay? I write the ordinances. I research the requirements for the codes and what we might do differently locally. So I don't get to wear most of the time I don't get to wear the real cool, heavy, hot, ridiculously uncomfortable gear. And I don't have to carry nearly the 65 pounds that Josh and his contemporaries take, although I have done it. So let's go to the next slide. I want to talk to you a little bit about all these impacts that fire has. And I want to start by telling you that everything in the code, for the most part, of any significance comes from a disaster or multiple disasters. Everything. So let's talk a little bit about it. Did you know that wildland fires are not new? The largest wildland fire for many, 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 many years occurred in October of 1871 in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. You might not realize it. This is a little bit north of Chicago, just almost directly adjacent to, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, to Upper Michigan. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Peshtigo, Chicago's down here at the bottom of Lake Michigan. This is up near the top of Lake Michigan. It occurred on October 8th, 1871. It was a prolonged drought. The temperatures were high all summer. Does that sound familiar? It burned 2,400 square miles of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan. That's 1.5 million acres in an area that's not nearly as big as Texas. And it completely destroyed a town of 1,700 called Peshtigo, Wisconsin. There were at least 500 confirmed deaths and $2 million in 1871 dollars. You can't get a CPI for 1871. Okay, so the earliest that you can go and calculate a relative cost is 1913. So that's $46 million. If you convert 1913 dollars to 2012 dollars, that would be $46 million in loss in a very small rural community. Next slide. But it was overshadowed. The very same day, most of you have heard of Miss O'Leary's barn, right? Her cow. The very same day, there was a major fire in Chicago. This fire only killed 300 people, but it caused $200 million in damage in 1871 dollars. That's about $4.6 billion if you convert 1913 dollars to 2012 dollars. Guess what? The wood was dry. Did you know your house the wood in your house, and the wood in your, it also dries out in a drought. It's dried anyway in a kiln, but it even gets drier in a drought in your house. There are gaps in your deck will get wider. The gaps between nailed lumber will get wider. And that's what everything in Chicago was wood in 1871. And it completely destroyed the vast majority of the city of Chicago. Other major fires, and every one of these fires caused people to do things differently. In 1631, the vast majority of the colony of city of Boston burned to the ground. They started their own fire department. First paid fire department in history of the United States, 1631 in Boston. There were major fires, wildland and building fires in Fayetteville and Raleigh, North Carolina in 1831. Boston had another fire in 1847 and in 1872, a year after the Great Chicago Fire. In California, talking about wildfires, there have been wildfires that were worthy of federal disaster declaration in California in 1956, 61, 70, 80, 85, 88, 90, and 2003. So California has had their share. In fact, California has been enforcing the Wildland Urban Interface Code for 50 years, or a version of it. And they still burn major cities down on a regular basis in wildfire conditions. Next slide. Other fires that have dealt with, Worcester, Massachusetts had a warehouse fire. It was vacant, started by vagrants, killed 6 firefighters. Sherwin-Williams fire was a warehouse fire. And this one was a hazmat fire. It was a paint fire. They let it burn because it set on top of an aquifer. Does that sound familiar? Centennial condos, $20 million in the Christmas season of 1996. We killed 9 firefighters in Charleston, South Carolina in 2007. And most of you know about our Echelon building fire here in 2010. But I'm going to touch both on wildland codes and on the fire and building codes as separate entities. The first standard for wildland fire safety was published in 1935 in the United States. It was published by the National Fire Protection Association, and it was predominantly for vacation and lodge homes in the woods. And it was literally, the title, I don't have the title here, it's in my notes. The title of it was something like the protection of vacation and lodge homes in the forest, something like that. It was modified over and over again until the 2003 edition, and it's currently known as NFPA 1144 and NFPA 1141. 1141 deals with subdivisions, and 44 is individual structures. This was a precursor to what we call the International Wildland Urban Interface Code, which was published for the first time in 2003. But it's really based on the contents and the background in NFPA 1141 and 1144. 1141, 1144, and almost everything that came before it came from wildfires in California and Colorado. The vast majority of the fires that drove the development of those two standards came from those two states because they have had some of the most serious fires, apart from the Peshtigo fire. One of the wildfires that was declared a disaster by the federal government was 1985. The 1985 fires in California drove the 1991 edition of the NFPA 1144 standard. Major changes. The standard changed as far as protection schemes as well as firefighting tactics and strategies. So a lot of the things that are doing now, that the Forest Service does now, and the training that our firefighters get to fight wildland fires and the gear that they're assigned to wear for firefighting in the wildland were developed immediately after the 1985 disastrous fire in California. Okay. Now, there are other fires out there that are really, really major. The Iroquois Theater, 1903. We'll talk a little bit about it in a minute. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, 1911. Coconut Grove. Does anybody know what that is? We'll get to that too. Winecoff Hotel. This is in Atlanta. It was a fireproof hotel. The Beverly Hills Supper Club Club in Kentucky, the MGM Grand Hotel fire in Las Vegas, DuPont Plaza in '86, that's in San Juan, Puerto Rico. First Interstate Bank was in Los Angeles. One Meridian Plaza was in Philadelphia. Of course, the World Trade Center and the Station Nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island. Major, major disasters, and they all resulted in code changes. All of them did, in some way, shape, or form. Next slide. This one I like to show because you have finish problems in your home. How many of you have synthetic draperies in your home? Oh, you're all lying to me. You're all lying to me. If you have drapes, none of them are cotton. Nobody in here can tell me all your drapes are cotton. You're lying to me, okay? Finish is a big problem. All of these multiple fatalities deaths, multiple fatality fires, occurred in buildings that had terrible finish problems. The Rhythm Club is almost never in the list. Do you know why? It was in Natchez, Mississippi in 1940, killed 212 people. They were people of color. And it was almost completely forgotten for many, many years. Coconut Grove. Coconut Grove was in 1942, and it was actually fortuitous. Now, it's silly to think that 500 deaths would be fortuitous. But it actually became the impetus for burn management that was used for the soldiers in World War II. It became the test ground, if you will, for medical processes that saved thousands of soldiers' lives in World War II. The Weinhoff Hotel fire was in a fireproof high-rise hotel in Atlanta. There is no such thing. But it was advertised that way. Almost all 119 deaths were high school students there for their prom. Almost all of them. This one, locked exits. Major, major problem. Stuff hanging on the walls all over it. This changed how hospitals were looked at. The Hartford, Connecticut fire changed how everybody looked at how you protected hospitals. Beverly Hills Supper Club started people saying, you know what? Getting drunk and fire are bad things. Okay? I'm serious. These two as well. But this one really, really got people's attention about drinking and fire. This one was an arson fire. We'll talk about it in a little bit. And this one made us want to outlaw stupidity. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide. Iroquois Theater. In 1903, it killed 600 people in a little over 10 minutes. It didn't even completely consume the wood slats on the chairs. It was started on the stage, and this fire caused the code changes that dealt with proscenium curtains and proscenium walls, required standpipes on stages on theatrical stages. This really changed how the fire service and various communities dealt with large assembly occupancies with stage productions. But it really, if you don't get tired of seeing this, you haven't really dealt with it very much. Locked exits are always a problem. How many architects do we have here? Design your building so people get out, even if you lock it, okay? This is an awful one. Next slide. Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This was a sweatshop. This was all young women, mostly immigrants. They were there making shirts for the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City. They were locked in their place so they couldn't go to the bathroom or leave before their assigned shift was over, because they just had to produce all those shirts. Killed 146, almost all of them young women. Almost all of them. Locked exits. If you get cited or your building permit gets turned down or you get your CO delayed because you have improper locking mechanisms, you deserve it. Okay, it's a terrible thing. Locked exits have killed more people than you can shake a stick at. It's just crazy. It's crazy. We should never do that. But you know what? This one didn't change the fire and building codes. It changed the labor laws. It changed the labor laws dealing with breaks, with safety of workers. It really was kind of a precursor to OSHA. So that was kind of an interesting thing. MGM Grand, none of these people were in the casino. Fire started in the casino. Started above the ceiling in a restaurant that was quote unquote a 24-hour restaurant. The 24-hour operation was the basis for the Las Vegas and Clark County Fire Departments not requiring it to have sprinklers. Well, they figured out that about a month or two after they opened, it wasn't long, it may have been more than that, but it wasn't long, that they didn't stay busy 24 hours a day, so they started shutting it down. Fire started above the ceiling, raced through the casino, which was also not sprinklered because it was a 24-hour operation. Nobody died in the casino, nobody. They all died in the tower from smoke migration. So it changed how we look at stairs. It changed how we do high-rise exiting. Next slide. DuPont Plaza. This one really didn't have a major code implication. This one really just told us that intentional fires, which we're going to talk about, intentional fires really can be as devastating, if not more devastating, than accidental fires. And we've seen that in many, many ways recently. Next slide. This one killed a guard. The guy got on the elevator. This affected elevator operation, by the way. This fire killed a guard, burned out 4 floors in Los Angeles. The guard got the fire alarm, but it didn't recall the elevator. And so he went, pressed a button. There's nothing. There's no fire. I'm just going to go check it out so I can call the owner and tell him not to worry about his fire alarm. Gets in the elevator, pushes the button. It opens up in a fully involved floor. He died instantly. So this one affected elevator operations everywhere except Chicago for existing buildings. Did you know in Chicago, Illinois, existing buildings still do not have to have an elevator recall? Still do not. The lady got killed this last year in Chicago in an existing high-rise building. One Meridian Plaza. This one changed how we do fire standpipes. Killed 3 firefighters and it started on the 22nd floor and burned to the top. They were retrofitting sprinklers, but the pressure regulating valves on the standpipe were wrong. They were installed incorrectly. There was no water in the standpipes. The firefighters got off on the floor, attached to the standpipe, should have had water. Everybody says, we're pumping you water, but there's no water. And the 3 guys died. It got to the top floor. The sprinklers were operable on the 38th floor and put it out in less than 3 minutes. So it's one of those things. $300 million in loss, by the way. They demolished it not because it collapsed, but because it racked. Next one. This one's one that really breaks my heart. This is the first fire that we really have live video of the fire development. If you haven't seen it, you need to come see me. I have it with me and I could play it for you, but I don't think we're going to have time. If we have time, we'll come back to it. Killed 100 people in 3 minutes. 3, count them. 3 minutes. Stupidity, improper design, finished material. It's crazy. Craziness. Should never happen. Should never happen. Oh, but back up. Oh, no, stop it right there. Stop it there. Did you know the next day, the fire marshal and I here in town went and looked at bars and restaurants in this town. We counted less than 5 that had the same foam plastic on their walls. And do you know why it had foam on the walls? It had a sound ordinance that said you had to maintain the sound level at a certain level at the property line. Does that sound like a city you know? Well, we went out the next day and we found 5 that had the same stuff on the walls for the very same reason. And they were all unsprinklered too, by the way. So, I can tell you, the codes are always, when you see something in the code and you say, I don't want to do that, that doesn't make any sense at all. Almost without exception, it's a disaster that caused it. Almost without exception. This is, some of you people have houses bigger than this, and it killed 100 people in 3 minutes. Charleston, South Carolina, the Sofa Superstore. Oh, gee. This one was investigated by the federal government. two different agencies of the federal government. The National Institute of Standards and Technology investigated it from a scientific standpoint, and NIOSH investigated it from the labor standpoint. Next slide. NIST actually modeled it. They actually recreated it digitally and did a fire model of it, and pretty much can tell you exactly how those people went and how those people died. Next slide. That's just another picture of it. Killed 9 firefighters. It caused, in the 2009 Building and Fire Codes, the threshold for sprinklers in upholstered furniture stores went to 0 feet. In the 12 code, it went back up to 5,000 feet. But in our current code, if you have an upholstered furniture store, it's supposed to be sprinklered if it's half a square foot. There's no threshold. And you know why? The industry wrote that code section. We did not. The fire service did not. The industry did that. The national government came up with 11 recommendations for the fire service, affecting everything from code enforcement to operations. And you've probably read some of that, haven't you? It totally destroyed the building and all of its contents. And I hate to tell you, but probably the most significant recommendations came for fireground operations, not necessarily for the fire codes on that one. Next slide. The only known high-rise collapses in the United States. Let's talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Look, and of course, we had one here that was a very similar situation. One more. Okay. For those of you that design, you live in design in a much different world than you did 30 years ago. A much different world. If you think that there's not another chance or another desire to have a terroristic activity occur in this country, you really probably need a little coffee or something, because I think you're asleep and you're dreaming. And I don't mean to be facetious, but I sit on 5 code committees nationally. In May of 2001, I was sitting on a code committee that was looking at high-rise design. And they wanted to, the new, at that time, brand new 2000 International Building Code was out. And this particular organization was the National Fire Protection Association Building Code Committee. And they didn't want to be any more rigid or stringent than the IBC was. At the time, up to 160 feet, you could derate your building for sprinklers in a high-rise, and you still can under the IBC, by the way. And my committee, I said, don't do that. We don't want to derate the buildings. It's too big a problem. And they said, well, no, you don't understand. We still have 2 hours. We still have a 2-hour, and that's sorry. 2 hours is to the standard time temperature curve. The standard time temperature curve does not reach 2,000 degrees for 4 hours. Okay? So the only construction materials out there that are rated for 2,000 degrees are 4-hour assemblies. Everything else is 1,500 or less for the most part. Flammable liquids ignited are 2,000 to 2,600 degree fires instantly. Instantly, not 4 hours down the road, instantly. And so they wanted to derate it to 2 hours, which would be a temperature rating of less than 1,800 degrees. And I said, no, let's don't do that. It's too easy. It would be too easy for people to compromise that. They said, oh, you're talking about terrorism. It will never happen here. Honest to goodness, that was told to me in May of 2001. And I've been told here in Austin, you know, we don't have to worry about that. Nobody's going to try to destroy a building intentionally in Austin. Nobody does that kind of thing here. Well, there's at least one family that really is sad that they do that here. So you should never, ever believe, especially if you have an iconic structure, a very large structure, a very large occupancy, you should never, ever, ever believe that it won't be attacked. There were a number of things that came from NIST on the World Trade Center. Fire service access elevators above 120 feet. We're designing about 20 high-rises in Austin right now. All of them have fire service access elevators. It also made occupant egress elevators an option. We actually have one in design now that's proposing to use an occupant egress elevator. That's not required. For anything other than an apartment or a condominium complex over 420, it requires a third dedicated stair for the fire service. Why did they do that? Do you know? Anybody have any idea? Counterflow, yeah. And when you start talking about an office, an office building at 10,000 square feet has 100 people in it per floor. So that's why the major reason for this one is for large populations to be able to move down the building while the fire service is moving up the building. It requires somewhat hardening of stairs. It requires the separation of stairs. The nearest wall to the nearest wall is 30 feet or 1/3 or 1/4 the diagonal of the building now, because you want to make them physically separated so that you can't take them both out with one event. That's a terroristic building design issue. Did you know you can get sheetrock that's designed for impact resistance now? And the durability of fire-resistant coatings was addressed in the 2009 code. And also, for these high rises that are being designed now, they require 2 water supply connections to the street, 2 independent, isolable water supplies. There were a lot that weren't required. And this recommended a target analysis approach for iconic buildings, mostly historic, unique occupancy, or large life loss occupancies. Iconic buildings might be government buildings. Might be Memorial Stadium or Kyle Field. It might be Irwin Center. That might be the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. The NIST suggested that those kinds of buildings have an analysis. So it didn't get approved because people couldn't decide what an iconic structure was. When you're writing law, people really want it to be easily interpretable. And so it's difficult to tell people, well, your building is or is not an iconic structure. I don't know. NIST also recommended designing buildings to resist disproportionate collapse hazard or progressive collapse. That was voted down too in the code development process, again for money reasons. But I will tell you that most of the federal projects that I know about are being designed to resist progressive collapse. So that should tell you that they think it's a real possibility. Let's talk about that. Next slide. So what do? You deal with exits. Next slide. You deal with fire-resistant construction. You make sure it's durable, that it's going to stay on the steel, or that the concrete is the appropriate thickness. You put sprinklers in where it's appropriate. You put in a fire alarm system where it's appropriate. Next slide. Next slide. It's got 2. We got elevators, okay? Elevators for firefighters. We got elevators for occupants. Did you know that there are criteria now that you can design your building to have elevators that will work in a fire, that won't be recalled to the first floor or the alternate floor, and that would be there for your wheelchair and other mobility impaired people? The criteria is there. It's expensive, and at least 2 projects in the nation that I'm aware of have chosen not to do it because of the expense. If you go to the IBC, Section 3007 is the firefighter access elevator provision. That one is required. You can't get out of that one. Expensive or not, you can't, if it's over 120 feet tall. And 3008 is the occupant egress elevator provisions. And I really think that at least jurisdictions, public buildings, should really start looking at 3008 in my mind. Next slide. And I got a bunch of references. So I guess my summary is every single code issue, including the wildland fire code issues, were driven by disasters. Almost every single one of them. There are a few exceptions, but there are not very many. Most all of the major dollar costing provisions are there because hundreds of people have died first. Some of them firefighters, some of them not. Some of them little kids. There was a major school fire in Cleveland in the 1890s. It killed almost 200 kids in less than 30 minutes. So, you know, a lot of the things we do about building schools are because of Our Lady of the Angels and because of the Cleveland school fires. They're all disasters. And really, if you will, we can be real flexible in designing buildings, but really the big things in the code are there because people died. And I think that's all I have to say, unless you have questions for any of us.
This may be a question for Josh. Talking about the embers getting into the soffit and attic vents, is that more for one story, or at a certain point, like a 3-story or 4-story, would you still worry about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would worry. What's that?
Can you repeat the question as well?
Oh, the question was in regard to embers, you know, and the susceptibility, I guess, to the structure based on the level or height, whether it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5-story building. Absolutely, it's always a concern because one thing I can guarantee is the embers are going to be there. They're going to be produced by any fire event, whether it's a car fire, trash fire, wildfire, another structure fire down the street. And so, yeah, it's absolutely going to be, the structure is going to be susceptible to those embers at any level. Does that kind of answer your question?
I just, sometimes if a sprinkler is required when your soffit or whatever is more than 4 feet, if that is 3 stories in the air,
Yeah.
you still put the sprinkler there?
If it's combustible construction, you do. If it's not a combustible roof or overhang, you might not.
So no distance from the ground.
Right? No, but it depends if it's a wood overhang, probably. If it's a steel and it's 3 stories, let's say we're talking across the street here in the middle of downtown, probably not. If you're building it in the wildland, probably.
And then for the soffit vents as opposed to a gable vent, like if you have a combustible roof construction that is 1 hour fire resistance required, and like you can put dampers or something in the soffit vents as required, but there's no requirement for the gable end attic vent, is that correct?
I'm sorry, I was
Talking about the susceptibility, or the difference in the susceptibility based on between soffit vents and gable vents. She referenced dampers being part of soffit vents, but not so much in gable vents.
Gable vents are bigger typically and have a lot more room typically for materials to get caught up in the vents, in the slats. I would want wire mesh in both, a very, very fine wire mesh in both.
But they're not going to do it unless it's required by code.
Well, the Wildland Urban Interface Code has actually 4 levels of fire resistant or ignition resistant construction, and it really depends on where you are in the interface as to what's required by that code if we adopt it. We're in the process of investigating adopting it. We're going to make a lot of local amendments like we do on all of our codes because our unique concerns, or at least we think they're unique anyway in Austin. And but we are looking at it, and the 4 levels of construction go from nothing to very, very ignition resistant, which would include soffit vent sprinklers, non-combustible exteriors, non-combustible decking.
And kind of referencing the screen mesh over the vents, it seems like commercially when they come out, just from looking at them in hardware stores and whatnot, they typically come with some sort of a mesh, but like I said, they are typically designed to resist rodents and stuff like that. What I would encourage you to watch in regards to attic vents, soffit vents, gable vents, even it doesn't have any ridge vents in there, is that NIST ember study that I referenced. It's on YouTube. They actually have cameras inside of the attic spaces. That one video I showed was embers coming up through the soffits, and it kind of compared the different soffit or different attic vent styles and kind of discussed how susceptible they were to embers and embers coming inside the structure. The gable vents are boogers. I mean, they're, and the way we look at it is if we're looking at the structure, again, at anything that is going to be facing, the wildland or the wind event as it comes in, if it's facing it at a flat angle or a 90-degree angle, it's going to be hitting head on, and so it's going to be much more susceptible. Those gable vents, if they're facing whatever wind event that's coming in carrying those embers, it's going to get hit really hard. The soffit vents tend to be up a little bit, up underneath a little bit better. And so depending on the mesh, you know, they don't tend to be as susceptible. Just from trying to pay attention to the structures that were lost on the fires that I went to, and kind of looking at gable vents versus the soffit vents, those gable vents really seem to get beat up pretty hard. I haven't seen a lot of study or a lot of information on the ridge style vents. Those seems like that kind of creates a little dead space over it as the wind goes over them. It didn't seem that they got hit near as hard as particularly those gable style vents.
Do you know of any statistics for sealed attics being safer?
I don't know of any statistics, but just from my limited knowledge of the WUI codes, it seems like that in some codes it does limit and restrict even attic venting.
It does.
Yeah.
I don't know. We've not built a lot of homes to the Type 1 ignition resistant standards, so it would be new for us too, to be honest with you.
But again, those codes tend to limit or restrict. There was a question back here, I believe.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relative danger of fire in central Austin as opposed to more of a wildland interface. Does our paving kind of create our defensible space?
Yeah, the question was the fire risk more interior to an urban city as opposed to the outlying areas or the wildland urban interface. I typically in my presentations I reference a fire in southwest Austin near down towards Circle C. It was a fire that was less than 1.5 acres. I want to say it was even less than 1 acre, and it threatened 24 homes and damaged I think 8. And so what we learned is, and that doesn't really reference interior downtown, but what I want you to take away from that is we love our green space. I love our green space. We want to protect our green space, but what it does is it definitely, I mean, if we've got any vegetation, I refer to everything as a fuel. If we have any fuels available and it's on fire, then it's going to expose anything around it. And so whether that fuel is a green belt, whether it's our backyard park, whether it's a drainage easement, whether it's a shed in the backyard, because as I said earlier, every fire is going to produce some embers. And so a lot of these principles that we talk about are going to protect the structures and the homes from predominantly those ember storms or those ember events. From a lot of the NIST studies and a lot of studies that were done by a gentleman called Jack Cohen, he did a lot of studies talking about the flame fronts as they move through. Typically, statistically, they tell us that those flame fronts from these wildfire events are only going to last anywhere from 30 seconds to 1.5 minutes. But those ember storms, you know, they're lasting hours. The U.S. Forest Service will tell us that those embers can be carried as far as 2.5 miles. Just here in central Texas, we've gone out and measured embers being carried or spot fires that have occurred as far as 1,400 to 1,600 feet away from the fire. Now those embers and how far they carry are going to have a lot of factors, whether it's the wind, the humidity, and most likely the type of fuel. But just because you're not next to if we're talking about wildfires, just because you're not adjacent to that that vegetation or that wildland, it doesn't necessarily make you exempt from any of these principles. I don't know where we were up here. Y'all fight it out. I want to see you thumb wrestle.
Well, I have an experience with this because we live in a PUD, and we have an exit plan, and we're hardening up stuff, but we live next to a preserve. The people who manage that preserve are not interested at all in getting rid of some of the underbrush. They're more interested in the black-cap vireo. And I contend that Parks and Wildlife have a responsibility in addition to the people who have responsibility around their homes. And we're not seeing that. It takes years of Sundays to get them out there to clear along their borders, the fire line.
What I would tell you is, one, we all have to recognize we have to live together and get along. And right now is when we all are hugging. We're talking about land management styles and getting things to happen. And so oftentimes we have to recognize our own responsibilities. We have to also recognize what those wildlands are for and why we're managing them, because there's umpteen different ways to manage a wildland. I'm not skating away from your question. my personal approach and what I've seen nationally from folks that are way smarter than I am, we tend to look at these issues more systematically. When I go into a community, you know, a lot of times people is like, you know, come in an hour early before you give a presentation. We'll go walk through this, or we'll go walk through that. I have an idea of what Central Texas looks like. I have an idea of most of what our homes look like, and it's not to bash those folks, but my main goal, and always my first goal, is to educate the homeowners. Because, as I said before, the biggest bang for our buck and the most efficient and cost-effective measures are going to be the stuff that can be done by the homeowner to the structure. Now, after that, we start looking at those fire-wise zones that we talked about, and we do start moving away from the structure. As we move away from the home, those principles and those practices get a lot more expensive, and the effectiveness oftentimes diminished. Because, as I said before, we all have to learn to be fire adaptive. We have to realize that we live in Texas. We live in a fire prone, I'll go even further and say a fire dependent state and area and landscape. And so the landscape that's out there, it needs fire in it. The vegetation out there needs fire in it. There's going to be a fire there one day, you know, and nothing that we can do aside from paving it is going to stop that from occurring. And none of us want that to happen. So how the land is managed next to you, I can't really comment. I would love to go out and meet with your community if you live in the city, or put you in, then you know what?
We've had your folks out.
Oh, it wasn't good enough? I'm just messing with you. I want to continue.
On the contrary,
sure.
It led to some rules within our HOA to harden all of those roofs and soffits and fascias and sides of buildings that are facing that preserve. But we also need help to get some of the dead stuff cleared out of that preserve. And we've even volunteered to help them from a cost standpoint. They're reluctant to hear that.
Where do you live? We'll talk later. I don't know if I answered your question. It is
more of a comment.
It is very much a comment, and it's not something that we're going to solve here. We've been trying to solve it for years, and I hope that we continue. And one day, with the Wildland Task Force, along with the WUI Code and the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, we'll get closer to that.
Good.
As we go on, as we keep moving through the questions, we've got plenty more time, but as people are creeping out, if you wouldn't mind dropping off your survey on the way out the door, I'd appreciate it. So sorry, back to your question.
And as people are leaving, I personally thank everybody for coming out and listening, and I know these folks do as well. So,
I have two questions. First of all, is composite decking more fire resistant than wood decking? And if so, is it enough more fire resistant that people should consider that as an alternative?
You want to comment on that?
And the second question is there anything that can be done to make composition shingle roofs more fire resistant? That seems like probably one of the primary places.
Well, composition roofs really are fairly ignition resistant. That's really not the problem.
Okay.
Wood shakes, even flame resistant wood shakes are much more susceptible to ignition than composition shingles. First part of your question, though, about the composite boards, right?
Wood decking, yeah.
A lot depends on what is mixed in the wood. The plastics, some of them are FR plastic, some of them aren't. For instance, if you have chlorinated polyvinyl chloride, it's much more difficult to ignite than PVC.
Okay.
So it really depends on the actual makeup of the plasticizer in the composite. And some of it's really good and some of it's not really good.
Okay.
There was actually a study by the State Fire Marshal in California exactly on that topic, and much of what came out was the distance and spacing between the boards, and then what the boards, if they were solid or hollow, or if they were variegated underneath. And what came out of that was that the FR resistance, yes, was a big deal, but most of what came out was it clear underneath? Was there underbrush underneath? And then how tightly spaced were the elements and were they solid? So the ones that were solid came out better, and the ones that were tightly spaced came out better. But anything, no matter what it was made out of, it was widely spaced apart. It was easy for the fire to get through. And if it was a hollow material, of course, it broke down easier than something that was a solid material.
Everything he said.
The spacing issue, you can actually space composites much closer and tighter than regular wood because they don't tend to warp. So one reason you put a space between wood joist and wood decking is warping, the movement of the wood. Composite materials typically don't warp, so you can really tightly space them.
That I would just kind of add on to what the gentleman in the back talked about, and I kind of alluded a little bit in the presentation. Part of the Firewise program talks about some of the composite materials, but also if you're going to use lumber or wood members, to use larger members that aren't hollow, that are more difficult to ignite, and also the protection below them and how it extends to it. So if you've got a wooden pillar coming out, don't just put it in concrete and let the vegetation grow up to it. Maybe put it on a pad, or at least have some type of fire protection or non-combustible barrier around it, which also goes back to some of the stuff we talked about in the past, having non-combustible barriers as landscaping features around the property. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I saw.
Hi. I've been told I have somewhat of a theatrical voice, so
all right.
I can carry a bit. You mentioned there's a potential conflict between sound mitigation in nightclubs, for example, and fire hazard. But are there materials commonly available to do sound mitigation?
Yes.
And have you since encountered, overwhelming support in using those materials?
There are lots of materials that are ignition resistant, flame resistant for sound deadening and sound insulation. The problem in 2003 was people were doing it on the poor. They were doing it on the cheap. If you get the flame or fire resistive sound insulation, it's much more expensive. It's listed, it's tested. It's much more expensive than some of the foams that aren't. And so a lot of people were doing it as cheaply as they could, and I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I mean, I don't want to waste my money either, but fire-resistant or flame-resistant foam insulation or insulation properties are really important if you're going to have lots and lots of people in your business.
So do you anticipate, now that there's more attention being paid on enforcing the sound ordinance here in Austin, do you anticipate having to go out and do more code compliance and investigations in terms of the materials used?
Well, we probably will, but a lot of the new emphasis is on sound hardening of exposures, not necessarily the clubs. Things like residential design is going to, some of the new code requirements are going to be to make them more sound hardened. And that's really a matter of the glazing more than it is the walls.
Question with LEED. Is LEED coordinating well with like fire departments and stuff as far as iconic structures because we do mostly military work. And a lot of the LEED structures we're seeing go in now, and the Corps of Engineers is forced into LEED, silver, and gold. I'm actually seeing a decrease in its ability to mitigate fire and blast, some of the other things you were talking about, force protection. And you look at some of the old structures, and a lot of what you were talking about is kind of already covered with fire embers, and also they're moving to new materials such as plastics and kind of non-prescriptive measures on fire. What is LEED looking at now as far as integrating with, you talked about sustainability.
The USGBC is pretty far behind in terms of integrating a lot of these NFPA standards. I mean, they've got some of the more basic standards from early 2000s, but anything more recent they haven't integrated into the new building version. There is a new version of LEED that's coming out that they are looking into some hazard mitigation techniques a bit more, but they don't have any sort of credit area for hazard mitigation resilience right now, and nothing that really specifically refers to recycled materials. Especially, there's certain types of material I can think of that might be flammable, that might be, or carpeting, or there's a lot of things you might put in the interior of a building that I don't think that LEED's really considering the flammability is that of those materials as much as they probably should be. I spoke not too long ago with the USGBC about hazard mitigation, and they're interested in having that be maybe a pilot credit area, but right now it's not incorporated into their rating system at all. You might be able to answer some more of that on fire.
Yeah, I'll add that real quick. What I've seen, if you don't mind, is the fire, when you look at as-built and new construction, it seems like the fire department life safety isn't brought into the equation as much as it probably needs to be. And even on like renovations sometimes.
It's not for LEED, that's true. We were looking at the Green Code. We had the International Association of Fire Chiefs had people monitoring the development of the International Green Building Code. And from our perspective, a truly green building is going to be sprinklered, because if you're talking about carbon capture, the way you keep carbon in a building is to not let it burn. And the only way that I know to make sure that it never burns is to sprinkler it and properly maintain it. So I think LEED should require sprinklers for any kind of serious LEED designation, but it's not, as far as I know.
LEED Platinum right now does not require sprinklers.
And I mean, the thing mostly being that it's the idea of disaster resilience and sustainability, and those things are seen as separate. You know, public safety deals with disasters, and they'll be there to save us. They'll have the hoses and they'll put out the fires. Yeah. And but we're about we're LEED. We're about making sure you have an accessible neighborhood that has a bike rack, and we're calling it gold, and we're done with the day. So it's bringing those two together and merging them to really leverage it.
With sustainability, because sustainability is kind of a 70,000-foot view a lot of times, maybe 100,000, but the building actually surviving. As we talk about fires and putting out fires outside, is that you got life safety inside. Well, is sustainability part of that structure staying?
Yeah, well, it should be. It really should be. That's what I'm saying. It really should be sprinklered if you want to get a LEED designation, because that's the only way for carbon capture to be relatively permanent. And but also, let me talk about energy efficiency, which is also an issue of LEED design. I know of at least one fire that the fire smothered itself because of the tightness of the building. Also killed a woman, but the problem is that we know for a fact that within 3 minutes of the initial ignition of the couch in this apartment, the oxygen level in rooms unaffected was less than 10%. And this was a grandmother that died in her apartment. If she had had a grandchild in the back bedroom, that grandchild would have been dead, and no one would have been able to determine it to be smoke inhalation, because there was no smoke back there. It would have been pure oxygen deprivation. So some of these really tight buildings have the potential to kill people that don't ever smell, breathe, or inhale smoke, simply because it's going to consume enough oxygen to become lethal in very, very short period of time. Also, how many of you have old cotton-batted couches and beds in your homes? That's all you have? I need to come live with you because that's pretty safe. It takes 27 minutes to ignite a 1960s vintage cotton-batted and linen upholstered couch and cotton and linen curtain living room. It takes about 3.5 minutes to completely flash over a modern furnished living room or bedroom. Less than 3 minutes.
Probably have that at the top of my keel.
And the smoke detector is going to operate in 90 seconds. So if the smoke detector operates at 90 seconds like it's supposed to, or a little bit less, and it's going to flash over the room in 3 minutes, that gives you 1.5 minutes to wake up and get out of whatever you're in. So we haven't been seeing fire deaths like that, but I think it's just fortune, good fortune, not necessarily good design or good operation. And by the way, we have some of the best firefighters in the country, but none of them can get there in 3 minutes. None of them. Nowhere in the country.
Leather couches, just curious.
Depends on what's under the leather.
Okay.
If it's polyurethane foam, you're going to burn up. You're going to flash over your living room in less than 3 to 5 minutes. Okay. It's not necessary. And leather, by the way, is a cyanide-producing fuel. It's, just so you know. It is. Yes, ma'am.
So is it avoiding synthetic materials in window coverings and in furniture? Is that the biggest thing that you can do inside, or are there other?
I would defy you to find any except in an antique store. I mean, really, go look.
Carpeting is made largely synthetic.
It's all synthetic. There's no wool carpeting anymore.
Yes, there is.
Not very much. Not very many houses have it.
In my house, it's wool.
You're fortunate. Not many people do.
Look at the vacuum fire resistance and the other chemicals that are produced long before.
Oh, well, the real killer is CO anyway. But leathers and a lot of synthetics, nylons that have a lot of nitrogen in them, they're cyanide producers as well as carbon monoxide producers. Polyurethane foam is really just solid gasoline. It really is. It puts out as much heat as gasoline per pound. And we sleep on it, and we sit on it, and we watch television on it. ABS plastics the same way, by the way. Most plastics in your televisions and your televisions and your computers are not FR plastics. Most of them aren't. So you got to realize that the furnishings that you go buy, the things that we take for granted as being conveniences and nice, and they are. I've got them in my room. My wife has a really nice couch in our living room, and we have a pillow top mattress. But I'm telling you, if it ever lights off, it's a real hazard. It's a real hazard.
Does the Fire Association or NFPA or whatever have a lot of influence on ICC codes for smoke and fire development? Because I'm seeing a lot of prescriptive measures. So for instance, like in polyurethane, they take the UL rating for drywall at half-inch, say.
So UL rating for drywall, what now?
Yeah, so they have a UL rating for half-inch drywall.
If it's type X.
Yeah, it's right now.
Yeah.
And then if there's, say, plastic foam insulation or something, they allow you to get rid of that and put a non-prescriptive measure on it, like an intimate coat. And so it gets back to the
spray on insulation.
Yeah, and the coat, the fire side of it, though, as far as rating those. Because again, in LEED, you're seeing a lot of that.
Yeah, I was just in a really heated debate nationally about protecting sprayed insulation. I wasn't participating there. I was just there to watch, but it was interesting. And it's really geeky. It would really take a lot longer to go through it than most people here are going to be willing to say. You can cover sprayed the plasticized insulation with just about anything that will keep it from igniting for, I think, 30 minutes or something like that. So there's a set time that the code, it's 15, you're right. The code requires that there's a set time that the foams do not become involved in the fire. But interestingly, there was or it may still be a way to do that with stuff that burns just as hot and just as fast. It just burns instead of the foam, which is kind of a weird thing if you think about it. Yeah, but that's a long discussion. Probably shouldn't get into that one.
One last question on you said.
I think we're going to have to cut it down. I'm sorry. In respect for their time that we have allocated.
Come see me.
Okay.
Come see me. I'm just down the street here, Texas Center.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming.